Welcome to the CAMBE webinar response to participants' questions on the science of reading neuroscience claims with linguist and neuroscientist Dr. Stephen Strauss. Approximately 100 questions were submitted for Dr. Strauss to address from his April 2024 webinar that is posted on the CAMBE website. The number of questions submitted made it necessary for Dr. Strauss to divide the response webinar into 3 parts. Dr. Strauss has identified trends and themes in the questions to cluster together as a focus for each part. Part 1 focuses on examining and comparing definitions and models of reading. Part 2 addresses the linguistics of the English spelling system in relationship to semantics and context. Dr. Strauss also responds to several questions from participants regarding limitations of fMRI technology. Part 3 is an elaborated response to some critics who raised questions about Dr. Strauss's perspective on the neuroscience research, both during and after the April 24 webinar. Again, Part 1 addresses examining and comparing definitions and models of reading, and also includes a response to several questions that suggested that there is a science of reading theory. We hope you find the information that Dr. Strauss shares with us to be both enlightening and useful for enhancing your professional practices in literacy and biliteracy education.
Greetings, everyone. Today is May 22nd, 2024, and we're excited to have Dr. Stephen L. Strauss here with us today to be able to respond to questions and provide answers to some of the questions that came up in our previous webinar, Debunking the Science of Reading Neuroscience Claims. And so we're excited to have Dr. Stephen Strauss with us. Also with us, we have Dr. Barbara Flores, who was also one of the moderators, as well as Dr. Jill Kerper Mora. Dr. Mora is a professor at San Diego State University, and Dr. Barbara Flores is a professor emeritus from San Bernardino, CSU San Bernardino. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Stephen Strauss so he can share with us what some of the overriding questions were that came up and what are some of those responses that are essential to be able to help provide more understanding around some of the information that was shared in our previous webinar. So Dr. Strauss, I'm turning it over to you. Thank you once again for joining us and being able to respond to the questions.
Thank you, Edgar, and thank you, Barbara, Jill, and Norm. I really appreciate this invitation, and I'm happy to discuss a very important topic that is, in some places, taking over the news. Just today, we heard about a multi-million-dollar donation to the state of Maryland, where I live, to reinforce science of reading curriculum in the classroom. So this is truly an ongoing project that we're facing to deal with the truth about reading and various problems that are confronting the educational system because of this. This is actually a very interesting topic, the study of language and the brain, and in particular, the study of reading and the brain. Part of my own background in this includes work that I did when I was a professor of neurology at the University of Maryland. I did work on reading problems and reading recovery with stroke patients whose language was affected. And I found some very interesting things with these patients. When they were given pages to read that they had written themselves, for example, letters to a spouse or other writings that they did themselves, even though it was hard to make out the individual words, their language flowed very fluently and very smooth, had normal intonation, normal spacing between words, normal phrasing. When they seemed to get to a part that they had trouble with, they would literally stop and use their forefinger to point to each letter in those words, as if they were using an alternative form of letter and word identification. But it was only when they struggled. For the most part, they didn't do that. When we worked with patients who were unfamiliar with the text, they hadn't written it themselves, for example, they stumbled almost throughout the entire text, pointing with their finger at each letter. In other words, trying to decipher or identify all of the individual component parts. It was very clear when texts were relatively easy to read through and when they weren't. And it was, in my opinion, evidence that a phonics type of approach, in this case, using a finger to point to individual letters, was really a strategy of last resort. I worked also at the University of Vienna in Austria as a professor of linguistics and as a researcher in the Neurology Institute there. I remember one interesting patient who spoke 5 European languages. He had a stroke, and all 5 languages were affected very differently. On the other hand, the stroke was only in one place in his brain, which meant that those 5 languages overlapped in the area or were learned differently because he learned them at different stages of his life and produced very interesting effects differently in each one. So as I said, I think that this is a very, very interesting field. It's fun to do research in. It adds a lot to our scientific knowledge of language. But the so-called science of reading approach to reading is, in my opinion, very, very flawed and needs to be taken on, not simply because its science raises many serious questions, but because it is now supported literally with millions of dollars, millions upon millions, to enter the classroom without any objection at all from professional teachers and educators or even parents and students. Well, we received close to 90 questions from participants at the last session. I was able to consolidate them into 5 questions, well, really 4 questions, and as well as a subsequent critique from Professor Stanislas Dehaene in France, who is considered one of the leading, if not the leading, researchers and writers of scientific experiments, which have come to be called the science of reading. One set of questions had to do with the definition of the science of reading. Another had to do with the nature of the evidence that the advocates of the science of reading offer, and that this is quite strong evidence in favor of a certain point of view. Another was, why did I refer so much to the politics of this rather than the science? Actually, my impression was that I mentioned the politics, but didn't really go into it in all that much detail, but we can address this question. Related to that was a question from one of the participants about why we didn't invite SOR people to the session, and I'll try to address that. And there were many questions about the implications of all of this for teaching reading. Professor Dehaene made a comment about the presentation, and I'll try to respond to Dr. Dehaene's comments themselves. Okay, before we even begin, I want to emphasize what I think is the fundamental question that we all need to address, people on all sides of this issue, and that is what actually is reading. The fundamental answer that seems very hard to refute is that reading is making sense of naturalistic visual language. By naturalistic, I mean texts, and by texts, I mean pieces of language that have a context. There is no context without a text. That's a crucial thing to understand, because the evidence that's used in research done by advocates of the science of reading do not include naturalistic text. There is no context other than the subject knowing that they're in an MRI machine with a test about to take place. That's the extent of the context. A reader develops context when a reader constructs meaning and moves to the next portion of the text. That meaning could serve as context. It's already something available to the reader to bring to the next stage of the text. But as we'll see, this is not really a part of the SOR research, and there are definitions that have been offered of SOR reading theory that strictly forbid the use of context. So it will be important to understand what reading is, and we'll see that this is tied in very much to another equally important question, which is, what is language? I think you'll see that I am emphasizing that what SOR people believe language is quite different from people who take a different point of view. Okay. There are a number of fundamental differences between the science of reading and other theories of reading. And let's focus in on that for a moment. Every approach to reading, which is carried out by people who want to learn more about it, want to understand more about it, is called a science. So calling it a science of reading does not distinguish the science of reading from any other theoretical and empirical approach to what reading is. They are all called sciences of reading by the people who advocate them. So in one sense, the so-called science of reading is really, in a way, hijacking the word science, because that doesn't distinguish their view from other people who promote their science of reading. It's odd that they call it a science of reading. They could call it a neuropsychological science of reading. There are a lot of names that they could use, but they call it the science of reading as if it is the science of reading. In addition, all of these approaches claim to be about reading. So to use the expression science of reading still does not distinguish the science of reading from any other theory of reading. They all claim to be science, and they all claim to be about reading. So what then is the fundamental difference between the science of reading and other approaches, other theoretical and scientific and empirical approaches to reading theory and reading practice? Well, the difference is actually in two things. One is the nature of the evidence that is used to support the theory, and the other is the view of language. What is language? What is human language that is part of the set of experiments, studies that are being done? And related to that is, what is the methodology that is being used to perform these studies? The major source of evidence that is used by the science of, I'll use the expression science of reading, even with the caveat that I just discussed. The major type of evidence that's used is pictures of the brain, which I will discuss, that come from a machine called an MRI machine, done in a way that produces pictures referred to as functional MRI pictures. And it is these pictures of the brain, sometimes both before and after treatment, which constitutes the bulk of that characteristic which distinguishes the science of reading from other sciences of reading. The subjects in virtually all of the science of reading experiments are given pieces of language to respond to. It could be words, It could be nonsense words that are pronounceable. It could be nonsense strings of letters which are not pronounceable. And it could even be false fonts. I'm still trying to figure out what role false fonts plays in a theory of reading, but they have been studied. So the linguistic units that the science of reading studies are abstract. They're not real narrative textual units that people encounter in the real world. You could try to justify what the science of reading people are doing with their methodology and with the evidence that they're producing by resorting to the notion that they are studying this experimentally, that they need to control for variables. And the only way to control for variables is by taking the language apart, moving things around, leaving some things out, and so on. And that way they'll be able to compare two different situations experimentally. Studying natural text cannot use that experimental approach. Studying natural text requires what is called an ethnographic approach. You cannot break the text apart. We are studying natural language, and the methodology has to be completely different because these are real pieces of language, not abstract pieces of language. The entire text has to be looked at. The reader who is reading the text produces responses to the text, which also have to be studied. Experiments occupy a different position with respect to alternative forms of or alternative models of reading theory. You have to wonder why ethnographic methodology is not resorted to by researchers in the science of reading, even though a number of them, and we'll see this, do understand that the functional MRI machine has a lot of difficulty, if not complete difficulty, in studying natural language. A number of them realize that that is a problem because what they really want to be able to study is natural language, but the machine itself brings some limitations to that. They have not looked at more than 60 years of research that studies the reading of natural text using ethnographic methodology. And in my opinion, that's unfortunate. They could certainly learn a lot if they were to do something like that. Okay, so as I said, the evidence that the science of reading people use is abstract pieces of language. One alternative, the one which I think explains the empirical data in the most efficient fashion and in the most principled fashion, has been referred to as whole language, which is also a teaching and learning approach that is part of constructivist psychology, a psychology that understands that readers construct meaning as they read a text. They don't actually pull the meaning out of the text. That bears on the nature of language. The science of reading advocates have a somewhat confused understanding of natural texts. They think that if you go longer and longer in linguistic units, from a letter to a sound, to a syllable, to a word, to a phrase, to a sentence, and then string the sentences together, that's what a text is. But a text in that approach is just as abstract as the other pieces of language they use. A text is not defined by its size, by how many sentences are strung together. A stop sign in the street is language in a context, so that single word is also a text. The larger pieces of language, texts in a science of reading research experiment, are not texts, even though they're larger, because they don't occur in a real context. Reading is reading in real context. And if it's not a study of reading. It's a study of something which may look like reading, but it's missing extremely crucial components. All right. All right, well, let's then, with all of that, think about why science of reading advocates are so excited about their functional MRI studies. One is that it provides a great deal of knowledge, they feel, on their part, but also it seems to lend itself to doing something positive for children who are learning how to read, and for diagnosing poor readers and figuring out ways to help them. Because if you can take a picture of the brain of a child who is reading and compare it to the brain of a child who is reading poorly, I should say, and then compare it to the brain on the fMRI pictures of a child who reads proficiently, who understands what he or she is reading, and then institute a type of treatment for the poor reader, you can then look at the new pictures of the poor reader following treatment and see if there has been some move towards what the normal picture is. So what's exciting about this for the SoR people who are doing honest research, in their view, unrelated in their view to politics, is that they have found a teaching method that can help poor readers. Well, we need to ask, is this sound scientific reasoning? And I would say, yes, it would be if the experiments they were doing was really about reading. But if it's not really about reading, then they can't make any claims. They can simply say that the new MRI, which they got following teaching something to the poor readers, merely indicates whether or not that poor reader learned what they were taught. It could be anything. It's important to keep in mind the evolution of reading theory, and the evolution not only of reading theory but of also the theories of psychology that incorporated those approaches. The science of reading, the current science of reading, quote unquote, has a history that is rooted in behaviorist psychology, which has been dispelled by numerous studies in cognitive psychology, yet its essential premise has been preserved. The essential premise of behaviorist view of reading is that each letter that's printed on a page or that you would see in the environment is a stimulus to the reader saying something out loud. And the reader has to learn, the beginning reader has to learn what sound you make when you see one stimulus, one letter, and what sound you pronounce when you see another letter. And then you string up those letters together to produce words, in this case, like pin or nip. And to show that you've learned and developed the correct habits, you may even look at non-words, PIDNIN, and pronounce them according to those habits that you've learned. So according to behaviorism, reading is the development of certain habits. There's a hierarchy, but what's crucial is that the language and the eventual meaning begins from outside the reader. The reader has to incorporate the language that's outside the brain into the brain itself, in this case by means of habits. The cognitive science view replaced the notion of habits with the notion of information processing. The way a human being responds to letters on a page is not by habitually associating sounds, but by processing the information which is contained in those letters, which is contained in the string of letters that they see. And by processing the information, they will then be able to jump from one step to the next. From a string of letters, they will be able to get information that that string of letters constitutes a word of the language, or perhaps not a word. And a string of words constitutes a phrase, not by habits, but by processing the information contained in the string of letters, in the syllables, in the morphemes, and in the words. And I mentioned a couple of well-known researchers in that view of psychology and in that view of reading. Then the neurological approach, or the neuroscientific approach, is based on another version of language coming in from the outside, from outside the brain, and being studied according to an interpretation of the brain in which the brain looks at various sensory stimuli. I don't mean looks at literally. I mean, there is visual information coming in, auditory information coming in, tactile, in other words, touch information coming in. They enter the brain from the lowest levels, become processed so that we now see that there's actually a circle in the visual field, or there's a musical sound in what we hear. And then those things rise up the ladder in the brain. They go to what's called the cortex, where we now develop meanings and interpretations. So the behaviorist view of habits, the cognitive science view of information processing, and the neuroscience view of the structure of the brain and how that information moves through the brain, all share the common assumption, the common view that language begins in the outside, from the outside, and needs to enter the brain and go up a hierarchy to finally get to something which can be called meaning. Meaning is the final stage of a process. All right, now there is a view of reading which has been present for about 65 years, has a massive body of literature and science to support it, which is not utilized by science of reading researchers. And again, I think this is quite unfortunate, but everybody makes choices. This is a model of reading within something called constructivist psychology, which I mentioned earlier. Constructivist psychology sees the brain, the human brain, as constructing mental representations. It's not as if something comes in from the outside and goes through a sequence of hierarchical steps. Rather, the brain uses the cortex, the top and front part of the brain, which thinks, which comes up with ideas, which plans, which interprets, which does all of those higher levels of human cognition. And it's those higher levels which now go down to the deeper parts of the brain, which even select what should come into the deeper parts of the brain and interprets them. It might even make a prediction about what it thinks it's going to see, what it thinks it's going to hear, and look at the deeper parts of the brain to see if it's right or wrong. If it's wrong, the cortex can revise its prediction, and if it's correct, the cortex can continue moving along to interpret the language. What the brain then brings to processing the information that's brought in from the outside is everything that's already there. The brain doesn't have to make up anything. It already has knowledge. It already has beliefs. It already knows how grammar plays a role in language. It also knows, at least to some degree, how letters relate to sounds. It knows the meaning that it has already constructed through the portion of the text that the reader has read through. So these are not things that the brain needs to make up. They're already there. And the science of reading that has been developed within the constructivist model of psychology simply says these resources are already available. Let's use them. Let's see if a reader uses them. The massive amount of evidence from the last 65 years of studying this have shown, really without a doubt, that readers use all of these resources. What the theories of reading that look at stimuli coming from the outside say is that the human brain does not use this. I won't say that they say that entirely. Many SOR researchers do acknowledge that the brain does make predictions. They are struggling with how to incorporate that in their theory, and all they have to do is turn on the light and look at constructivist psychology and what we now call, as the model of reading within that, the transactional socio-psychological model of reading. All they have to do is look at that for the evidence. They could decide on their own if they accept it. All right, now, so here I mentioned again the neuroscience view, which is that that information comes from the outside. Russell Poldrack is a very well-known neuroscientist. I've read his writings. He's an outstanding thinker. And he writes in one of his books that the brain extracts information from the world. The constructivist view of psychology says, no, the brain does not extract information from the world. The brain constructs information using, the brain constructs meaning using information from the world, but by combining it with what it already knows. In fact, there's no other way to do it, because even if you extract information, it has to coincide with what you already know. It has to fit in. And if it doesn't, you need to start revising your view of the world. So just to repeat, SOR sees reading as extracting meaning from visual language. It also, and you can see this in a number of articles, sees reading as reading for information. Extracting information goes along with that. Reading for information is only one type of reading. Reading includes reading for pleasure, reading fiction and experiencing the emotions of one of the characters, reading poetry. Those are not really reading for information, but there are many different motives and purposes in reading. Reading for information, you might want to think about this, ties itself very neatly into the STEM model of education now: science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, which is really, for the most part, reading for information. There are functional MRI studies that look at the concepts that engineers are reading as part of the STEM educational model. Is that a coincidence, or is there something else going on that is funding and informing and promoting both STEM educational models and functional MRI research? I think you might be able to figure out what I think about that. Okay, so summarizing the transactional, and by that we mean going back and forth between visual language and the brain. Let's just summarize the main points here. And this is from an article that you see referenced at the bottom by me, Kenneth Goodman, and Eric Paulson, that reading natural text is what reading really is, that the function of the brain, rather than to extract information, is to make sense of the world. It's the kind of thing similar to breathing. If all of a sudden you can't breathe, you think about it. But if you can breathe, you never think about it. If your brain is making sense of the world, you don't really think about it. You just continue doing what you're doing. But if all of a sudden you don't understand something, you stop in your tracks and you say, wait a minute, something's not right here. That's what the brain does all the time. It makes sense of the world. And therefore, since reading is one of the things that the brain does, it tries to make sense of that world, which means making sense of text. There is abundant evidence from two main sources of research material, one called miscue analysis and the other eye movement studies, which have provided the enormous amount of empirical findings to support this view. And I would encourage people who are not familiar with it, including, it seems, many of the SOR people, to look at it. Okay, next. Okay, I hope you can see this, and I apologize if the if the graphic is not clear enough, but I'll certainly let you know what's going on. This is a small example of miscue analysis. You simply ask the young child or adult or whoever it might be to read what is before them. And you can see in this example that the text contains the following sequence of words: between the roof and the ground, to your liver. Her usually restless, tall, hung straight down, not twitching at all. I'm sorry, I made a miscue. Her usually restless tail hung straight down, not twitching at all. If it bothers you to think of it as babysitting, etc., etc. What did this reader do? This reader, instead of saying ground, said gorun, as if it were spelled Gorun. Instead of saying liver, said liver, Liver. Instead of saying twitching, said twigching. And instead of saying fathers, said I can't even read it, distraubles. What's interesting here is that the reader accepted something which was phonically related to the word on the page, but was a nonsense word. It made no sense. There is no word gorin. There is no word liver. The others are not words either. But the reader accepted this and continued. The reader did not go back and correct, which a good reader, a proficient reader, would have done, realizing that this word doesn't make any sense. So here's an example of what a good reader does. I'll make some porridge for you. I'll light a fire in the fireplace, and the porridge will be ready in a few minutes. That's on the text. What does the reader say? I'll make some porridge for you. The R is repetition. I'll light the fire in the fireplace, and porridge will be ready in a flash. Well, the reader goes back and corrects and I'll to then state and the, because and I'll porridge, we assume this is the reason, does not make sense. But going back, the words on the text are the ones read out loud. Same thing happens with in a flash, that's corrected to in a few minutes. A few minutes is a little different than a flash. I'll light the fire is kept the same. There's not much difference in I'll light the fire or I'll light a fire. There is some, but they both make perfect sense. So this reader is emphasizing meaning over graphophonics. The previous reader is emphasizing phonics, graphophonics over meaning. This reader can tell you what the story was about. The other reader will have a lot of difficulty telling you what it's about. Here is an example of eye movement. I won't spend much time on this, but what's interesting about eye movement studies of text is that a full third of the words are not fixated on, somewhat less are not even seen at all. The full third is not entirely omitted because there is a periphery around the fixated word that the reader can still see, but many words are left out. And yet, if this reader were to read the text aloud, every word would be there. Well, that's a very interesting finding. How could a reader not look at certain words and yet read them out loud? How can the SOR people even explain that? That's an empirical finding that has many years of support. This is not just one isolated reader. This is over and over and over again. The only explanation that makes any sense is that the reader is predicting the words that are not looked at, and because the human brain has evolved to become an outstanding predictor, or else we would not have survived probably, the predictions in reading a text for words that are not even looked at is quite good. Okay, let's move to some of the neuroscience. Here you see the brain. This is the right side of the brain and the major lobes. The frontal lobe, which is considered to be the executive part of the brain. It thinks, it plans, it interprets. The parietal lobe, the frontal lobe is also involved with movement. The parietal lobe is where sensory information comes in, the sense of touch, visual information gets there from the occipital lobe. The temporal lobe is involved in many things, including hearing, but other things as well. Here are MRI pictures, functional MRI pictures, showing in the lobes that I just mentioned, different parts of the brain that light up when a subject is asked to read and or to listen, and their comprehension is tested. They might have to answer a question: is this story about a cat, a dog, a rabbit, something like that? And you can see there are different parts of the brain that light up in reading and listening, although many studies show it's not so different as you might think. Here again is a busy slide that shows different parts of the brain. You can see the right side of the brain all the way to the left, and the left side of the brain to its right. The red areas are the areas of the brain in the different lobes that I just mentioned that light up when the subject is asked to do something. By lighting up, I mean that the nerves in those parts of the brain become excited. They start to get activated. They put out electrical currents when they light up. And we'll actually discuss that a bit more because it's not simply that. You'll see in studies, in some of the studies, that the brain will light up when a real word is presented to the subject, when a pseudo word is presented, like FLAD, F-L-A-D. It's not a real word, but it can be pronounced. When letter strings are presented, and false fonts, like the letter E upside down. The fact that you can get MRI pictures of false fonts and letter strings and pseudo words even, but let's emphasize false fonts. What that shows is that the MRI machine is capable of taking pictures of otherwise completely nonsense and useless stimuli, if we want to call it that. The pictures from a functional MRI are not necessarily interesting or important just because the MRI can take a picture of it, nor are they necessarily parts of a reading theory just because the MRI machine can take a picture of it. Are false fonts really part of a reading theory? Has anybody proposed a reading theory where the reader has to know how to recognize an upside down A or an upside down E? Yet the MRI machine can take a picture of where in the brain the reader is seeing that, responding to it. That's a very important concept because science of reading researchers, functional MRI researchers, use inputs, stimuli that, in my opinion, and in the opinion of many researchers in this area, are playing really no role in reading. They've looked at language areas in bilinguals, and maybe you can't see this, but I hope you can. Most of the studies involving Spanish and English readers point to essentially the same parts of the brain that are activated, but there are some differences in some studies. These are very interesting. I think they're interesting. So we can look at now some in way of summary and anticipating what we'll do next, some basic questions that we can ask about functional MRI research compared to others. The first we touched on: why is functional MRI able to discover where words are represented in the brain? Well, the answer is very simple: because words are represented in the brain. They're not represented in your belly. They're not represented in your foot. Of course, the MRI has the potential to discover where words are if it's taking a picture of the brain. So that really is no big deal. The MRI machine, using functional MRI technology, can detect which neurons, which cells in the brain are being activated. And basically, that's why it can take a picture of that. We still don't know anything about reading. All we know is the the subject was presented with some input, false fonts, real words, real phrases, even real abstract sentences, and we can take a picture of it. Keep in mind, though, that just because the researcher says that he or she is studying sentences, that doesn't mean that if you look at the study, that it was really about sentences. We'll get more into that a little later. Okay, another reason why that the SOR people resort to justify their approach to studying reading, the approach which says that you have to, at the very first, sound out the letters that you are getting visually. In fact, Professor Dehan in France has written that the visual step is the first step in reading. You have to take the visual language and convert it to the spoken language. Why is this the case? Well, what they argue is that oral language, spoken language, language you listen to, is natural. It's biological. It came with the first human being. We still have it. But reading came much, much later, tens and tens of thousands of years after oral language evolved with the evolution of the human organism. And for that reason, written language, visual language is unnatural. How can the brain process it? The brain was not developed to use written visual language, but only oral language. And the only way it can therefore manipulate and use visual written language is by first converting it to spoken language. Then the brain has the resources to figure out what you're reading. One example that I think of when I think about that argument, and maybe you could think of others if you don't think that mine is valid, is whether or not we have to teach children when we are helping them learn how to walk, whether or not we have to bring them into the woods and first have them walk on natural surfaces like rocks and mud and things like that, since the first humans learned how to walk on that. Do we have to then, only after the children have learned how to walk on mud and sand and rocks, can we then teach them how to walk on carpeted surfaces? Carpeted surfaces only appeared a little while ago. So the argument, I think, is parallel. Maybe you could think of some that convince you even more. Okay, I've alluded to the fact that just because the MRI machine can take functional pictures of somebody who is turning visual language into spoken language, that does not necessarily mean that that is a study of reading, especially when we see that you can take a picture of somebody reading or pronouncing a nonsense word or recognizing false fonts. So what if it turned out that all of the studies that on so-called reading that the functional MRI people are doing turns out to be wrong, simply wrong? It's not about reading. They give the subjects letters and strings of letters, but they figure out this is not what real readers do. Real readers do something else, and whoops, I was making a mistake my whole life. Well, then what would we be forced to conclude about all those studies? It's not that they're invalid. They're only invalid as studies of reading, but they're not invalid as studies of MRI machines. They tell us what MRI machines are capable of doing, whether they're completely useless things or useful things. MRIs are extremely powerful instruments, and they can take pictures of otherwise things that we otherwise may never use whatsoever. All right, let me talk a little bit about how the MRI machine gets those pictures. When we do something, anything, which includes moving or listening to something, moving or seeing something, it could be both productive or receptive. The nerve cells in the brain that are responsible for those activities, those behaviors, those thought processes get more blood. The nerve cells are acting as they should. They are producing electrical currents now where they didn't before. or at least not the same type. And as a result, they need oxygen from the blood, and the oxygen starts to flow to those neurons. Now, the MRI machine is not really capable of seeing the electrical currents in the nerves, but it can see the flow of blood. It can see the oxygen that's in the blood. And because the oxygen has magnetic properties, the MRI machine, which is simply an enormous magnet, can see which way the blood will turn, lining up its poles when the magnet is turned on. So the functional MRI technology doesn't really see where the nerves are activated. It sees where the blood is flowing. Okay, on this slide, you see two curves, the red one and the blue one. The red one indicates the nerve cells in the brain that are being activated when they get some input. It could be a word on a page, it could be watching a bird in the sky, it could be hearing some music, whatever. The nerve cells start to activate. It's called neural activity. The blue curve shows the movement of blood towards the nerves that are now activated. What you notice is that the movement of blood starts sometime later than the activation of the nerve cells. The activation of the nerve cells takes place within milliseconds. The blood flow to get to its peak takes a few seconds. That's several orders of magnitude different. And it's precisely this difference between the time the nerve cells are activated to do their thing, to put out electrical currents, which is how the brain works, along with neurotransmitters. There's a significant time lapse between that and when it gets its blood. It initially uses some of the blood that's there, but then it needs more. This time lapse creates problems in interpreting the functional MRI pictures. Functional MRI has, as a result of that time lapse, something which is called very good spatial resolution. What that means is that if two different activities occur in the brain, you may separate them by time. The neural activity can be found for one of those inputs in one place and for the other input in another place. The MRI machine is very good at telling where the two activities took place. They don't overlap necessarily. They don't merge together so that you can't see the spatial difference. MRI are very good at that. But because it takes several seconds for the picture to be made, that means you have to wait a few seconds before that red picture appears on the screen after the nerves are stimulated. Because you have to wait a few seconds, the MRI machine is not going to take a good picture of any of the material that first started the action and then continues later on for a few seconds. So if you give the subject several words in a row, even a sentence, there is going to be that time lapse. The MRI machine will be able to take a good picture of what happens right at the beginning when you pronounce one word, but not very good pictures the more you get into that longer string of words, because it takes a long time and you won't be able to see the peak. You get what's called a smear. So it's well known by the science of reading people, the neuroscience researchers in this area, that there is poor temporal resolution, it's called, because of the slow hemodynamic response. Hemodynamic simply means the movement of blood. There is research that is trying to improve MRI technology so that you don't see as big a gap. That will help reading studies improve, because now you'll be able to analyze not only where a linguistic input goes or where different ones go, but you'll be able to see them better in the course of time. You could see that this notion has been discussed by scientists of reading. One has written, or a group of scientists have written, that another shortcoming of past neurobiological research on comprehension is that it has rarely examined reading beyond the single sentence level. And even in that case, researchers understand there's a problem, in part because of the technical limitations involved in neuroimaging design. I hope you don't mind that I'm reading this, but I think it's important. Such investigations will provide a closer approximation to naturalistic readings, as adult skilled readers rarely read disjoint sentences in isolation. They're looking for newer techniques which can try to help the MRI machine read or interpret more naturalistic input.